Settle in. Get comfortable. Sometimes the most dangerous thing a king can do isn't wage a war. It's dig a ditch. Chapter 1. The Grain Carts. The Alpha King of 5 territories rode north, expecting to find a crisis. His father's elders, the 3 men who had helped Aldrich Mercer write the old charter 40 years ago and had been telling his son what to think about it ever since, had briefed him thoroughly. Disease, violence, structural collapse, rogue wolves beyond the northern border living without an alpha bond, which the charter said was biologically impossible, which meant whatever they were doing up there would be ugly. Grant had read the charter. He'd read it at 11, again at 14 when he presented, and once more at 21 when his father died and left him the 5 territories and a system he had never questioned because it had never been questioned. The charter said wolves needed alphas. It said this clearly and often, and with the quiet certainty of a document that had never been tested by anyone motivated enough to walk into the wilderness and check. He was checking now. 400 soldiers, 8 days on the northern road. The border marker, a granite cairn his father had placed 30 years ago, the northernmost edge of the kingdom's authority, and then beyond it, the kind of country that looked like the end of jurisdiction. Rock, scrub pine, mountain passes too narrow for supply wagons, and then the valley opened. Irrigation ditches, a working mill, smoke from 40 chimneys, fenced pasture with sheep, a school, a small one, tucked beside a stone hall with a timber roof and a flag he didn't recognize, green, with a white ring on it. His wolf had been a constant presence for 14 years. Not a voice exactly, Karen didn't talk much, but the hum. The low dominant frequency that ran underneath everything Grant did, the alpha signal that every wolf in any room responded to, whether they wanted to or not. It had been there since the day he presented, as steady and unremarkable as his own heartbeat. It stopped. Not strategically, not as a choice. Cairn simply went quiet the way a sound goes quiet when you walk into a room with different acoustics. The hum met the valley, and the valley did not respond to it. 600 wolves living in it without an alpha, without hierarchy, without the signal that the charter said held wolves together, and the signal, finding nothing to bounce off, just stopped. Grant stood in the market square for a full minute. He had never heard his own skull this quiet. He kept checking, the way a man pats his pocket for a wallet he's sure he had a moment ago. He reached for the hum. Nothing. Reached again. Nothing. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of something else. Birdsong. Wind. The sound of a mill grinding grain. A world that did not require his frequency to function. Quiet, Karen said. The first word in 14 years that wasn't underneath something else. Just the observation, laid out flat, like a stone placed on a table. Grant waited for more. Karen had always been spare, not the frenetic kind of wolf, not the kind that narrated, but there had always been the hum, the baseline. Now there was just the word and the space after it, and the space was enormous and unfurnished, and Karen seemed, if Grant was reading him correctly, relieved. Quiet, Karen said again. Not distressed, the way a man says, finally, when a noise he's been enduring for 14 years suddenly stops, and the world turns out to still be there. Somewhere to his left, a woman was arguing about cheese. She was standing between a grain cart and a man with a wheel of something crumbly and yellow, and she was making a point about weight per bushel pricing with the specific intensity of a person who understood that the cheese argument was load-bearing. She was not tall. Sturdy, practical build, the kind of body that had done years of work and carried the evidence without apology. Dark blonde hair cut short, not styled, cut, the way a woman cuts her own hair with a knife and a basin and doesn't think about it again. Brown eyes, steady and warm. Ink on her fingers, the third and fourth, the stain pattern of a left-handed writer. Fair skin, sun-marked across the bridge of her nose. She did not notice him. She did not notice him for 4 minutes because the cheese argument had reached a critical juncture involving seasonal variations in milk fat, and Grant, who governed 5 territories, who held counsel with 30 advisors, who had navigated 2 border disputes and a trade embargo, stood beside his horse with 400 soldiers behind him and waited for a woman to finish arguing about cheese. She turned. She looked at him. She looked at the horse, the column, the soldiers, the banners. Something in her face did a brief calculation that was not impressed. "You're blocking the grain carts. I am the Alpha King. The grain carts don't care." She said it the way she'd said everything about the cheese, practically, without malice, as a fact about grain carts. Then she turned back to the cheese merchant and said, "3 coppers a wheel, Alden, and not a half copper more, or I'll buy from the Ridge Hill Dairy, and you know their curd sets better in cold weather." Grant looked at his captain. His captain looked at the sky. She finished with the cheese. She turned back to him and said, "You want a tour." "I want an inspection." "Grant, it is a tour. You want to see how it works. You can say that." She knew his name. She used it the way she used the cheese merchant's name, as a fact, not a title, and the difference was so complete that something in his chest, the part that had been holding the alpha hum for 14 years, felt it like a crack in a wall he hadn't known he'd built. He took the tour. Her name was Margot Linden. She was 27. She'd been exiled at 23 for refusing the pack assigned to her under the old charter, the law that said every wolf must belong to a registered pack, that lone wolves were unstable without a permanent alpha bond, that an omega without her assigned structure would come apart. She had not come apart. Beyond the border, she'd found 300 wolves already there, rogues, exiles, the ones who'd left or been pushed, living in a valley with no alpha, no hierarchy, no registered anything. They farmed, they built, they raised children. They were, by every measure except the ones that mattered to the kingdom, fine. They were fine because of a thing nobody in the kingdom had ever bothered to learn: omegas could bond. Not the fated kind, not the claiming kind. Communal. Voluntary. Temporary, renewed by choice rather than enforced by rank. A web of small bonds, layered across a settlement like roots under soil, holding everything together without a central trunk. Margot didn't invent it. She found it already happening, decades old, invisible because nobody in the kingdom had ever asked a rogue what they do instead of falling apart. Over 4 years, she'd helped build Hearthpack into a settlement of 600 wolves with a charter, a rotating council, trade with 3 mountain villages. She was not the alpha of Hearthpack because Hearthpack did not have one. She was the woman who had arrived first and worked hardest, and nobody bowed to her for it, and that was the point. The tour took 3 days because the settlement was large and because Grant kept stopping. At the school, where 40 children were learning arithmetic from a woman with a limp who had been a border pack teacher before the pack dissolved. At the mill, where the grinding mechanism had been built by a former blacksmith and a former shepherd, and the design was inefficient and beautiful, and it worked. At the healer's lodge, where a man with one eye was treating a sprained ankle with the calm competence of someone who had been doing this for years without anyone's permission. Margot walked beside him. She explained things when he asked, and didn't explain things when he didn't, and the silence between explanations was not uncomfortable. She moved through the settlement the way water moves through a channel, easily, along paths she had made herself, greeting people by name, stopping to check a fence post or adjust a sluice gate, and every time she stopped, she noted the exits. Not obviously, not with fear, the way a woman who had built a life on open doors simply knew where the doors were. Every room she entered, every square she crossed, Margot knew the way out. Not because she was planning to leave, because knowing the way out was what let her choose to stay. Grant noticed. He watched her eyes track the doorways, the paths, the openings. He had seen the same pattern in wolves on the border, the prey logic, the way an omega's instincts mapped every room before the omega sat down in it. It was wolf behavior, not habit. and it was so deeply integrated into the way she moved that most people would never have seen it. He saw it because he had spent 14 years with a wolf, and a wolf knew what it was looking at. At the school, she stopped walking. She stood at the doorway and watched the children, and something in her went very still. Not human still, but wolf still. The particular focused immobility of a prey animal, watching something it loves, from a distance it has chosen. Her shoulders dropped, her breathing slowed. Her brown eyes went steady and warm and very, very careful. And Grant, standing 3 feet behind her, recognized the stillness as something he had been trained to read since he was 14, and had never seen this close to tenderness. He filed it. He knew what to file it under now. At the far end of the school, a boy of about 6 was drawing on a slate. He looked up, saw Grant's tunic, the quality of the cloth, the way the soldiers at the valley entrance carried themselves. The boy's face did something complicated. "He's one of the Ridge Hill kids," Margot said. Quiet, matter of fact. His pack was dissolved under the charter. His mother was assigned to a pack in the Western Territory. She refused. They were exiled. He was 4. She looked at Grant, not angry, not accusing, just present, the way she was present about everything, directly, without decoration. "Your charter, Grant. Your seal on the exile orders. Your elders enforcing your father's law under your authority." He didn't answer. He didn't have an answer. The charter had been running for 40 years, and he had been signing the outputs of it for 11, and he had never come north to see what the outputs looked like when they were 6 years old and drawing on a slate. "Quiet," Karen said, but the word was different this time. Not the relieved quiet of a wolf discovering silence, the quiet of a wolf hearing something it should have heard years ago. On the morning of day 3, she gave him a task. "The irrigation ditch on the north field needs extending before the thaw. The soil is soft enough to dig. I need it done by the end of the week." He looked at her. "I did not come here to dig ditches." "The ditches don't care either." She walked away. He stood at the edge of the north field with a shovel in his hand. And 400 soldiers camped at the valley's entrance. And the quiet in his skull so unfamiliar, it felt like a new room in a house he'd lived in his whole life. He dug. He was bad at it. Not because he lacked strength. He could split a training dummy in half with a practice sword, and had once carried a wounded soldier 2 miles through a mountain pass. But digging a ditch was not about strength. It was about angle, about reading the soil, about knowing when clay gave way to gravel and adjusting the cut. He didn't know any of this. He attacked the earth the way he attacked everything, directly, with force, with the committed determination of a man who had been governing for 11 years and had never once been asked to do something he was simply bad at. "You are digging at the wrong angle," Karen observed. "I know. The gradient is wrong. I am aware. She will tell you the gradient is wrong. I am going to keep digging. At the wrong angle. Yes." It was hot by the 2nd hour. By the 3rd, the shirt was off because the shirt was a pretense and the sun didn't care about pretenses and the dirt didn't care, and apparently nothing in Hearthpack cared about anything he was supposed to be, which was terrifying, and underneath the terror, the first real relief he'd felt in 11 years. Margot came out to supervise. She stood at the edge of the ditch with a mug of water and said, "Your angle is wrong." And he said, "I know." And she said, "It needs to be 3 degrees south to catch the snowmelt from the upper ridge." And he adjusted the angle and kept digging, and she stood there and explained the clay layer at 4 feet, and she was halfway through a sentence when her mouth stopped making words. The man in the ditch had shoulders that did not make sense. Arms that were doing things to the dirt that she was processing with a part of her brain she had not authorized for this task. His back was brown and broad, and the muscles across it were moving with the specific mechanical precision of a man who did everything thoroughly. And the thoroughness was the problem, because she was watching him be thorough about a ditch, and her body was drawing conclusions about thoroughness that had nothing to do with irrigation. She catalogued it the way she catalogued everything, quickly, practically, with the assessment skills of a woman who had survived 4 years on her own judgment. Tall, lean, muscular, the kind of build that came from use, not decoration. Dark hair, nearly black, cropped close. Strong jaw with a day of stubble that the ride north hadn't allowed him to address. Eyes that were gray in council light and something else in sunlight. Warmer, the gray of river stones, not the gray of iron. A scar across the back of his right hand, old and silver, the kind that came from training or fighting or both. Close, said Briar. One word. Flat. The first time Briar had said that word in 5 years. Briar was the quietest wolf Margot had ever heard of. Not suppressed, Briar was always there, always present, the way the ground was present under your feet. But Briar didn't talk. Briar observed. Briar was the most practical wolf in a valley full of practical wolves. The animal layer of a mind that had built a settlement with her bare hands and needed nobody's permission, and certainly nobody's wolf, to tell her what she already knew. Close, Briar said again. Then nothing. Just the word and the silence after it, like a stone dropped into water. Margot finished the sentence about the clay layer. She went to refill the water. She came back. She did not look at his back again for 20 minutes. Then she looked at his back again and was furious. Chapter 2. The Wall. The fire argument started on night 1 and did not stop. Every evening, after the settlement had quieted and the children were in bed, and the last of the day's disputes about cheese and fence posts and whose turn it was to muck the sheep pen had been settled, Margot and Grant sat at the fire in the square and argued. Night 1, she said, "The charter says wolves need alphas for stability. Define stability." He said, "Functional governance, conflict resolution, resource distribution." She said, "I have all 3, without an alpha. Your definition just described a postal service." He opened his mouth, closed it. She watched a king fail to find a rebuttal to the postal service, and the failure was the funniest thing she had seen in 4 years of building a settlement. Night 2, she asked him how many exile orders he'd signed in 11 years. He said he didn't know. She said, "Roughly." He said, "Several hundred." She said, "And you never followed up." He said, "The charter." She said, "The charter is not a person, Grant. You are a person. Several hundred is a number. You should know what the number looks like when it's 6 years old." He was quiet for a long time after that. She noticed his hands when he argued. Large, scarred on the right, and he moved them very deliberately, placing them on his knees when he wanted to look composed, gripping the bench edge when she landed a point, folding them when he was thinking about something she'd said that he couldn't dismiss. She was cataloging his hands the way she cataloged the drainage angles, and the catalog had stopped being professional around night 1. She sat nearest the path. Always. The one with a clear line back to her quarters. Not from fear. From the instinct that said, the exit is what lets you stay. She was aware of the distance between them. 8 inches, his shoulder to hers. She had measured it on night 2 and confirmed it on night 3. And by night 4, she was maintaining it with the specific precision of a woman who understood that precision was a form of control, and control was a form of not doing the thing she was not going to do. Cairn had been quiet for 3 days. Not the old hum quiet. The new kind. The kind that was actually the absence of noise. And Grant didn't know what to do with it. He kept reaching for the frequency that had always been there. The way a man reaches for a light switch in a dark room and finds the wall blank. Then, on night 3, Cairn spoke. Her. One word. Not an observation. A direction. As if every compass in Grant's body had been recalibrated, and the needle was pointing at the woman 8 inches from his shoulder, and the needle was not going to move. Grant looked at Margot. She was making a point about jurisdictional overlap in the eastern trade routes, and her hands were moving and her chin was up, and there was a smudge of ink on her jaw where she'd pushed her hair back with her writing hand, and the smudge was doing something to his ability to process jurisdictional overlap. Karen said again. Then, after a long pause, "The ink. I see the ink." "Do you?" "Because you have been looking at the ink for 2 minutes, and you have not heard a single thing she has said about the trade routes." He asked about the voluntary bonds. She explained, the omega web, the communal bonding, the way 300 wolves had been doing it for decades before she arrived. And while she explained, she handed him a cup of tea. Their fingers didn't touch. She made sure of it. The making sure was its own admission. He smelled like pine resin and cold stone. She noticed on night 2, and catalogued it the way she catalogued the drainage angles, practically, as data. And by night 4, she had stopped pretending the catalog was practical. Pine resin and cold stone, with something warmer underneath when his wolf surfaced. Something that smelled like the inside of a den, like warmth kept inside rock. She sat 8 inches from it every night and breathed it in, and filed a formal complaint with her own lungs. Night 5, he said, "If the charter is wrong, why hasn't anyone challenged it?" She said, "They did. They walked into the wilderness." That's what a challenge looks like when the system doesn't have a court of appeals. His jaw set. Not the managed set, the real one. The one that meant she had said something he couldn't argue with and he was sitting in the fact of it. She said, "You look like a man who's just been told the bridge he's standing on isn't a bridge." He said, "It is a bridge. It was built by people who knew what they were doing." She said, "It was built by people who never crossed it to see where it went." He was quiet. Then he said, very dry, "I am beginning to understand why the elders were uncomfortable." She almost smiled. Almost. The almost was worse than the smile would have been. Night 6. His hand brushed her shoulder, reaching for the firewood. He froze. She froze. The contact lasted less than a second, the backs of his fingers against the wool of her shawl. And the second lasted longer than any second had a right to last. Her breathing shifted. Not faster, shallower. The prey pattern, the involuntary catch. He heard it because wolves heard everything, and the sound of her breath changing was the loudest thing at the fire. Karen said again. Quieter this time. Patient. The word of a wolf that had set the needle and was content to let it point. Night 7. She passed him the cup. Their fingers overlapped on the handle. Neither let go. 4 seconds. Maybe 5. His fingers over hers on warm clay. The argument about trade routes stopped. The fire cracked and resettled. 600 wolves were asleep, and nobody was watching, and his fingers were on hers, and she could feel his pulse through the cup, because wolves could feel that. And she had not wanted to feel that in 5 years of Hearthpack. He let go first. She wrapped both hands around the clay. She held them there and did not look at him. His eyes flashed amber. 1/2 second. The firelight caught it. A ring of warm gold at the edges of his gray irises. The wolf surfacing involuntarily. And she saw it. She saw it because she was looking at the fire and he was beside the fire and the amber reflected. Every wolf knew what amber meant. She had spent 5 years proving she did not need what amber meant. Close, Briar said. Not asking, not suggesting. Stating, the way Briar stated everything, flatly, without commentary, and then waiting for Margot to catch up with the obvious. Margot said, "The tariff structure is outdated," in a voice that was not quite right. Grant said, "I agree," in a voice that was not quite right either. They did not touch again for 3 days. 3 days of fire arguments conducted at arm's length, with the specific care of 2 people who had identified a problem and were managing it by pretending it did not exist. 8 inches maintained. The maintaining was its own language, and both of them were fluent. Day 10. A storm hit during a supply run to the mountain village. Margot and Grant were caught on the trail and sheltered in a storage barn, soaked, close quarters, 1 lantern, rain hammering the tin roof so loud that conversation required being close enough to feel the other person's breath. She wrung out her hair. It was a practical action. She was a practical woman. She twisted her hair over one shoulder and water ran down her collar, and she pushed the wet strands off her neck, and none of this was for him, and all of it was in front of him. He was looking at the wall. The wall was wooden. It was planked. It had no features of any kind. He was studying it with the committed focus of a man who was not looking at a woman wringing out her hair 3 feet from him. You are staring at a wall. The wall is structurally interesting. It is a plain wall. I am finding it very interesting right now. She looked at him. She looked at the wall. She understood what the wall was doing for him. Something in her chest, the part that had said close 4 days ago, and had been saying it since, and had been ignored since, turned over. She wrung her hair more slowly. She did this on purpose, and she knew she was doing it on purpose, and she was angry at herself for doing it, and angry at him for not looking. And both of those were the same anger. He did not look. His jaw did something she had never seen a jaw do. A clench so tight the muscle at the hinge stood out like a cable under the skin. And his hands at his sides curled into fists, and he was holding himself in place the way a man holds a door against a storm. She could see his breathing, the deliberate rhythm of a man counting his inhales, because the alternative was not counting, and the alternative was 3 feet away and wringing her hair. "Stay," Karen said. Not to Margot, to Grant. The word was an anchor, a weight dropped to hold him in place, and the fact that Karen was using the same word about a barn wall that he usually reserved for things he wanted permanently was not lost on Grant. She thought, for the first time and against every principle she had built her life on, I want him to stop looking at the wall. She did not say it. He did not stop. The rain lasted an hour. They sat on opposite sides of the barn and did not speak, and the not speaking was so loud the rain couldn't cover it. She cataloged the barn. 2 exits, the door they'd come through, and a loading window on the far wall. She sat nearest the loading window. Even here, even now, the instinct was bone deep, know the way out, and staying means something. You are ignoring me about this, Breyer said on the walk back. I want that on the record. Noted. I'm not going to stop saying it. Also noted. You wrung your hair slowly on purpose. I watched you do it. You did it on purpose, and now you are pretending you didn't, and I am a wolf, Margot. I can smell the difference between accident and intention, and that was intention. Are you finished? Close. The walk back was worse because the storm had cooled nothing. They walked 3 feet apart on a trail built for one, and every time the trail narrowed and their arms nearly touched, neither of them acknowledged it, and the not acknowledging was a whole second language. He stayed 2 weeks. He was supposed to stay 3 days. Nobody in Hearthpack commented. Hearthpack did not comment on people's choices. Night 12. The fire. 8 inches. You are not what I expected, she said. What did you expect? Your father? He was quiet a long time. The fire was low. His hands were on his knees, palms down, deliberately flat. Then, in the voice he used when the managed mode dropped, the voice that was not the king and not the alpha and not the man who held counsel with 30 advisors, but just a man sitting at a fire 8 inches from a woman he could not stop measuring his distance from, he said. I have been governing inside his system for 11 years. I maintained it because it was what he left, and maintaining it felt like keeping something of his. The charter, the pack law, the structure. It was his. I kept it the way you keep a man's coat after he's gone, not because it fits, but because it's his. It doesn't fit, Grant. I know. I have been standing in your market square for 2 weeks, and I know. His voice cracked on the second no. Not dramatically, not loudly, a small fracture, barely audible, the sound of something load-bearing admitting it has been carrying weight it was not designed for. She heard it because she was 8 inches away and because wolves heard everything, and because she had been listening to this man for 12 nights, and she knew, now, the difference between his composed voice and his real one, and the real one was the one that cracked. His hands were on his knees. They were not fists. They were open, palms up, the deliberate openness of a man who had been taught to hold things lightly because holding them tightly was what his father's system did. He looked at his own open hands and he looked tired. Not the political tired, the real kind. The kind that comes from wearing a coat that doesn't fit for 11 years and finally saying so out loud at a fire to a woman who was not his advisor and was not his counsel and was just a person who had built something better without him. Karen said nothing. For the first time since the valley, the wolf's quiet was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something too honest for words. Neither of them closed the 8 inches. Both of them knew they could. The knowing sat between them at the fire like a third person. She did not reach for him, not because she didn't want to, but because wanting was not enough. She had built Hearthpack on the principle that nothing worth having was worth having if it cost someone their exit. Reaching for him would close the distance, but it would also close the door. And she could not be the thing that closed a door for another person. So she sat, and he sat, and the fire burned low, and the 8 inches stayed, and it was not enough, and it was exactly right, and both of those things were true simultaneously. He's not going to close it either, Briar observed. Because he looked at a wall for an hour rather than look at your hair. He's not going to take something you haven't offered. He's just going to sit there and maintain the 8 inches and wait for you to decide. I know. And you're going to sit there and maintain the 8 inches and wait for him to decide. I know. This is going to take forever. Probably. Close, Briar said, and then gave up for the night. The coat. The rider came at dawn, a single scout, half-wrecked from the mountain passes, sliding off his horse in the market square with the specific urgency of a man carrying news he didn't want to carry. Margot was there first. Grant was there second. The 8 inches between them collapsed to 4, and neither of them noticed because the scout's face was doing the thing faces do, when the message is worse than the ride. The Harshaw border lords had moved, 400 displaced wolves from the Eastern famine. The same wolves Hearthpack had been absorbing for weeks, straining the granary, doubling up in every house, had drawn attention. The Harshaw lords claimed the valley sat inside their territorial boundary. They were mobilizing. They had 600 fighters. They expected to arrive in 9 days. Margot's first thought was the school, the 40 children, the woman with the limp who taught them arithmetic. Her second thought was the exits. Not the physical exits, the philosophical ones, the options, the ways out that let you choose to stay. She cataloged them the way she cataloged everything, fast, practical, Briar running alongside her consciousness like a second set of hands sorting through the same drawer. 2 options. Grant could claim Hearthpack as Crown territory, bring it inside the border, inside the charter, inside the system she had spent 5 years building an alternative to. His soldiers could defend it. His authority would hold. The Harshaw lords would withdraw, because challenging a border lord was politics, but challenging the Alpha King was suicide. The cost. Everything she had built. Hearthpack under the old charter meant alpha hierarchy, registered packs, mandatory bonds. The voluntary system, the communal omega bonds, the rotating council, the freedom to leave and the choosing to stay, would be legally dissolved the moment his seal touched the document. Or he could do nothing. Let the Harshaw lords take the valley. 1,000 wolves lose the only free place they had. Margot looked at both options before he said either. Don't claim us. He looked at her. They will take the valley. Don't make us yours to save us. She was steady. Her voice was steady. Briar was steady underneath her, the deadpan practical wolf holding the line the way she always held it, without flinching, without raising her voice, just flat and present and honest. That is not saving. That is collecting. The word landed. She watched it land. Collecting. The word his father's charter had been doing for 40 years without calling it that. Assigning wolves to packs, registering bonds, drawing lines around people and calling it structure when it was custody. Find another way, she said. There may not be another way. Then look harder. She walked away from him, toward the school, toward the children, toward the part of Hearthpack that mattered more than the argument and more than the 8 inches and more than the thing at the fire she had not named and was not going to name, while her settlement was being threatened by men who thought they could take it because nobody had told them they couldn't. Grant watched her go. The way she walked, weight forward, fast, purposeful, the dark blonde hair catching the light, and the ink-stained fingers already curling into fists at her sides. She walked like a woman going to fix something, and the specific shape of her going to fix something was doing things to his chest that he could not file under governance. There may not be another way, he said to nobody. Cairn said, stay. Not about Margot, about the valley, about the quiet, about the thing that happened when a wolf who had been carrying the alpha frequency for 14 years set it down in a place where nobody needed it, and discovered that the absence of need was not the absence of worth. Grant went to her kitchen table. He sat down. He started writing. The treaty took 4 days. He wrote it at her kitchen table at 3 a.m, the same table where he'd eaten bread and argued about trade routes and sat across from her while the firelight made her brown eyes look like something he was going to remember for the rest of his life. She wasn't asleep for all of it. On night 2, she came down for water. He was in the middle of subsection 4, the mutual defense clause, the part that would require him to defend a settlement he had no legal authority over, which was the kind of constitutional innovation that made lawyers weep. She stood in the doorway in a wool shawl and bare feet, her hair flattened on one side from the pillow, and said, "You're still writing." Subsection 4. How many subsections? 7. And you've been on 4 since midnight. 4 is complicated. She came into the kitchen. She poured water from the jug. She set a cup beside his elbow. She was close, leaning past him to reach the table, her shoulder 6 inches from his face, and her scent was different at night, warmer, the clean rain and bread softened by sleep into something slower, and the shawl had slipped on one shoulder and the skin there was pale and freckled, and he looked at subsection 4 with the absolute concentration of a man whose peripheral vision had become his worst enemy. Grant. Subsection 4. Is important. Very. She stayed. She sat across from him. She read the pages he'd finished, one at a time, and while she read, he watched her read. The way her eyes moved, the way she held the pages, the frown when she found a clause she disagreed with, and the slight nod when she found one that was right. Her bare feet were on the rung of the chair, and her shawl was pulled tight, and the candle made shadows on her face, and he was writing a treaty that would crack his own authority, and she was reading it across from him in bare feet, and the kitchen was 2 people at a table at 3 in the morning, and the proximity was worse than the barn, because the barn had walls to look at, and the kitchen only had her. "This clause," she said, tapping subsection 3, "you're giving us trade parity with the Eastern Territories." "Yes." "That's more than mutual defense. That's economic recognition." "I am aware." "The elders will resign." "I am aware of that too." "You could write a simpler treaty. Mutual defense only. It would be enough." He looked up from subsection 4. He looked at her, the candle between them, the pages between them, her brown eyes across the table. "Enough," he said, very dry, "is a word I have been reconsidering recently." She held his gaze for 3 seconds too long. Then she looked back at the page and said, "Subsection 5 needs work." And her voice was not quite steady. He went back to writing. She went back to reading. The kitchen was warm and the candle burned low, and neither of them acknowledged the 3 seconds, and neither of them forgot them. She went back to bed at 4. He did not sleep. He finished subsection 4 with a specific concentration of a man who had just watched a woman read legal clauses in bare feet and was now required to construct a constitutional argument while his hands wanted to be doing something entirely different. He did not claim Hearthpack. He recognized it. A sovereign settlement with treaty rights and mutual defense. No alpha bond, no crown authority, no submission. A legal category that had never existed because nobody had ever built what she'd built. She found him at the kitchen table at dawn on day 4. He had not slept. The treaty was finished. His handwriting on the final page was the tight, controlled script of a man who knew exactly what he was signing and was signing it anyway. "I signed the exile orders," he said without looking up. "Yours was one of them. I didn't read the names. I signed them in batches, 50 at a time. Your name was in batch 14. She stood in the doorway. She didn't say anything. "I am not going to tell you I didn't know what I was doing. I knew. I knew in the way that someone who signs something without reading it knows. I knew enough to sign and not enough to see where the signature landed. That is not ignorance. That is something worse." "Yes," she said, "it is. This treaty does not fix that." "No, it doesn't." "I know," he said. "I am signing it anyway." "Quiet," Karen said. The word that had started as relief and had become something heavier. The quiet of a wolf who was listening to his human say the most honest thing he had ever said. At a kitchen table, at dawn, to a woman whose exile he had signed without reading her name. The recognition treaty was the most expensive thing he had ever done. He sent it south by courier. The first elder resigned within hours of reading it. The second resigned the next morning. The third, the oldest, the man who had co-written the original charter with Aldrich Mercer, who had stood beside Grant's father when the border marker was placed, sent a single line. "Your father would not have done this." Grant read it at her kitchen table. He set it down. He said, to the empty room, "I know." "He wouldn't have," Karen said. Honest, blunt. "He wouldn't have, that's the point." "Also," Karen added, after a pause so long Grant thought he was finished, "the elders are going to be insufferable about this for years. I want you to know that I do not care. I have never cared less about anything the elders have done. I did not care when they were here, and I care even less now that they are leaving. This is the most I have said in 14 years, and I am using it to tell you that the elders can write as many letters as they want." Grant stared at the wall. Not a barn wall this time, just a kitchen wall. But the staring habit was apparently permanent. The treaty cracked the foundational premise of Grant's own authority. If wolves could be stable without alphas, and the king had signed that into law, then the king's power was not biological necessity but political arrangement. Political arrangements could be renegotiated. He defended the valley. 400 soldiers under a treaty with a settlement that did not need him. The Harshaw lords arrived on day 7. 600 fighters against 400 soldiers. Bad odds if it came to it, and for 3 days it nearly came to it. Grant's soldiers held the eastern pass. The Harshaw lords held the ridge above it. 2 armies looking at each other across a quarter-mile of mountain rock, while Margot ran Hearthpack behind them as if a border standoff were roughly as interesting as a cheese price dispute, which, to be fair, it was. On the second day she brought him lunch at the pass. Bread, cheese, water. She handed it to him in front of 400 soldiers and said, "You're not eating enough." He said, "I am managing a standoff." She said, "You can manage a standoff and eat bread. I have seen you do 2 things at once." He said, "When have you seen me do 2 things at once?" She said, "You argued about trade tariffs and maintained 8 inches simultaneously for 12 nights. That is the most impressive multitasking I have ever witnessed." He ate the bread. His captain looked at the sky again. "She brought you lunch during a military standoff," Karen observed. "She brought bread and cheese to a border conflict. She is treating the Harshaw army the way she treats the cheese merchant. I want to be clear that I find this deeply and personally reassuring, and also I would like more bread." On day 3, the Harshaw lord's second in command rode down to the pass with the treaty in his hand. He'd read it. Sovereign settlement. Mutual defense. The Alpha King's seal. Attacking Hearthpack wasn't border politics anymore. It was an act of war against the crown itself. They withdrew on day 4. Not because the soldiers were enough, because the treaty made the math impossible. Then Grant had to leave. The horses were packed. The guard was waiting. She was standing at the valley's edge, where the road began its climb out of the settlement, and the morning light was behind her, and she was wearing the same practical clothes she always wore: linen shirt, leather belt, the ink stains on her 3rd and 4th fingers, and she was not crying, and she was not reaching for him, and she was not doing any of the things that would have made this easier. She was just standing there, with the exit behind her and the valley behind the exit, and the freedom to walk in either direction. He turned to say the sentence he had been building, the one about the north field, the irrigation extension, the spring drainage, whatever neutral architecture he had constructed to hold the thing he actually meant. She walked up to him before he got the sentence out. She straightened his collar. It was the smallest possible gesture. Her hands on his collar, adjusting it, pulling the fabric into line, the way a woman adjusts a man she considers hers. She did it without thinking, her fingers on the wool at his throat, quick, practical, the same hands that had built a settlement and dug ditches and argued about cheese, and she had done it the way she did everything, directly, without permission. He went completely still. Still the way a wolf goes still. Not the human kind, the animal kind. The kind where the body stops and the eyes change, and the wolf is right at the surface, and the surface is very thin. His eyes were solid amber, not a flash, full gold. She was close enough to see it, and close enough to see it meant the wolf was not behind the man anymore. The wolf was the man, and he was looking at her hands on his collar with an expression that had nothing political in it at all. The guard looked away. The whole valley looked away. 600 wolves who lived on voluntary bonds knew what a voluntary gesture looked like. She stepped back. Her heart was doing something she would file a formal complaint about later. Her hands were doing something she would have a serious conversation with them about later. "Your collar was crooked." He did not say anything. His voice would not work right now, and they both knew it. "His voice is not working," Breyer observed, "because you touched his collar. I want to point out that you have been ignoring me about this for 2 weeks, and you just touched his collar. I am not saying I told you so. I am simply establishing a factual record." "Come back in spring," Margot said. "Bring the shovel. Leave the crown." He rode south. He did not look back because looking back would mean stopping, and stopping would mean the thing in the barn and the thing at the fire and the collar, all of it. And he would not leave, and the kingdom needed him to leave. Karen said stay the way a stone says stay, by being exactly where it is and not moving. 4 months. She sat at the fire every night. Same bench, same path behind her, same 8 inches of empty space to her left where nothing was, and where the scent of pine resin and cold stone was not, because it had ridden south with a man who had not looked back. She didn't count the nights. She counted the drainage angles instead, because drainage was a thing she could control, and missing someone was a thing she could not control, and the distinction mattered. The ditch he'd dug was good. It wasn't great. His angle had been off on the first 30 feet and she'd had to correct it. But it was dug by a man who had never held a shovel before, and who did everything thoroughly, and who had taken off his shirt because the shirt was a pretense, and she had stopped mid-sentence about clay layers, and she could still feel exactly where her voice had stopped. Close, Breyer said, on a night in February when the fire was low and the wind was cold and the bench was empty. He's 400 miles south. I didn't say it was convenient, I said close. The word doesn't come with a distance specification. She stared at the fire. She missed the arguments. She missed the specific way he gripped the bench when she landed a point. She missed the ink smudge on his jaw and the managed face and the real face and the crack in his voice when he said, I know, for the second time. She missed the 8 inches in the particular way that you miss a distance you chose to maintain. Not because the distance was good, but because the choosing was, and now there was no one to choose the distance from. She went to bed. She did not file a formal complaint with anyone. There was no one to file it with. 400 miles south, Grant sat in council chambers and did not listen to the trade report. He was thinking about her hands, the ink stains, the calluses. The way her fingers had moved on the treaty pages at 3 a.m, tapping subsection 3. The bare feet on the chair rung, and the shawl slipping on one shoulder and the skin there, pale and freckled, that he had not looked at directly because looking at it directly would have ended subsection 4. He was thinking about the way she wrung her hair in the barn, the water on her collar, the slow version she'd done on purpose, and the fury in her face about doing it on purpose. He had memorized a wall over it. He could still describe the wall. 14 planks, horizontal, 3 knotholes, a rusted nail head in the upper left. He had studied it with the academic precision of a man whose alternative was unacceptable. He was thinking about clean rain and warm bread and the particular way her brown eyes looked in firelight. Her, Karen said, the same word. 4 months and the needle had not moved. I know. The shovel is in the corridor. I know. It has been in the corridor since October. You moved it from the armory to the corridor. You did not tell anyone why. Your captain has been stepping over it for 4 months. I am aware of the shovel. Spring is in 3 weeks. I am aware of spring. I am simply noting that the shovel and the spring exist simultaneously and that you have been staring at council reports without reading them for an hour, and the trade commissioner has asked you a question twice. Grant looked up. The trade commissioner was, in fact, waiting. My apologies, Grant said. I was thinking about drainage. The trade commissioner accepted this because kings thought about drainage sometimes. Grant went back to the report. He did not think about drainage. He thought about 8 inches and bare feet and a collar he could still feel being straightened, and the particular quiet in a valley 400 miles north, where his wolf had stopped humming, and a woman had told him the grain carts didn't care, and she was right about the grain carts, and about everything else. Chapter 4. The Angle. He came back in spring. He brought the shovel. he did not bring the crown. He rode in at dawn with no soldiers, no banners, no entourage, just a man on a horse with a shovel strapped to the saddle, and the specific posture of someone who had been thinking about a ditch for 4 months. She was in the north field when she saw him. She was checking the sluice gate on the upper channel, the one that fed the new orchard she planted in February. The trees still spindles, still fragile, and she looked up and he was at the far end of the field, dismounting, unstrapping the shovel. Her hands stopped on the sluice gate. Her breathing went shallow. The prey catch, the involuntary thing that happened when Briar surfaced without warning. She was aware of the field between them, 300 feet of new grass and mud and the unfinished ditch. And she was aware that 300 feet was not 8 inches, and she missed the 8 inches so sharply it hurt in her hands. He brought the shovel, Briar said, flat, utterly unsurprised. He brought the shovel and he left the crown, and he is going to take his shirt off within the hour. And I need you to know that I have been saying close for 4 months, and I am not going to say I told you so, but I am going to make a face, and the face is going to say it for me. He was in the ditch by 9. The ditch needed extending. It actually needed extending. The spring thaw had shifted the drainage pattern, and the north section required another 40 feet of channel to reach the new orchard. She had been planning to dig it herself next week. He was digging it now. Shirtless by 10, because it was warm, and because the shirt was a pretense and both of them knew it. She came out at 10 with water. She stood at the edge. He looked up. She looked down. The ditch was between them. Literally, physically, a gap in the earth she had designed and he was digging. He looked at her, and 4 months of not looking at her hit him in the chest. She was the same. She was exactly the same. The short, dark blonde hair, the ink-stained fingers, the way she stood with her weight on her back foot, as if every position she took in the world was provisional, chosen, revocable. Her linen shirt was rolled at the sleeves, and he could see the muscles of her forearms, the working muscles, the ones that came from 4 years of building ditches and sluice gates and a settlement. And her wrists were narrow and brown, and there was a new callus on her left palm that hadn't been there in autumn. And he noticed the callus the way he noticed everything about her now, which was completely and without his permission. She smelled like clean rain and warm bread, the scent of hearthpack itself, the grain from the mill, the earth from the fields, the particular quality of mountain rain on warm stone. He had been smelling it in his sleep for 4 months, the ghost of it on his own clothes. And the real thing was so much worse than the memory that Karen said her with a finality that sounded like a door closing. She sat on the edge. She put her feet in the ditch. The angle is wrong. He straightened. He was breathing hard from the work, sweat on his chest, dirt on his hands, the gray eyes looking up at her from below, which was a geometry she had not anticipated and was now enduring with the composure of a woman who had endured famine and exile and could certainly endure a man looking up at her from a ditch he was digging for her orchard, with his shirt off and his hands dirty, and his eyes doing the warm river stone thing that she was going to have a very firm talk with her own pulse about. The angle is fine. It needs to go 2 degrees east. It does not need to go 2 degrees east. She slid into the ditch. The ditch was not built for 2 people. It was narrow. She was standing in it, and he was standing in it, and her shoulder was against his chest, and the 2 degrees was not the point, and had never been the point, and she could feel his heartbeat through her shoulder blade, and it was fast, and his breathing had changed, and hers had changed, and the ditch was narrow, and neither of them was adjusting their position to create space. 2 degrees, she said. Margot. 2 degrees, Grant. He put one hand on her waist, not pulling, just landing, the way a hand goes to a thing it has been thinking about for 4 months and has stopped being able to not reach for. She turned, in the ditch, his hand on her waist, her shoulder against him, looking up because he was a foot taller and the ditch made it worse. His eyes were amber again, full amber, and she was looking into them the way she had looked into the fire on night 7 when she'd seen the first flash and her stomach had dropped. Her stomach dropped again. It had been dropping for months. She was tired of it dropping. She was tired of the 8 inches and the wall and the barn and the collar and every careful distance she had maintained because she'd built a settlement that did not need alphas, and wanting one felt like a betrayal of the principle. But she did not want an alpha. She wanted the man in the ditch, the man who dug it without being asked, who cracked his own father's charter to protect her settlement, whose wolf went quiet in her square, who looked at a wall for an hour rather than look at her hair, because looking at her hair would have meant something, and he was not going to take something she had not offered. She had not offered. She was offering now. She put her hand on his chest, on the bare skin above his heartbeat. She could feel it, fast, faster than a king's heart should go, the heartbeat of a wolf who had been holding still for 4 months and could not hold still anymore. "The angle is fine," she said. "I know." "I came into the ditch to fix an angle that was fine." "I know." "I have been ignoring my wolf for 4 months. I have been looking at walls." She almost laughed. Almost. The laugh was there, right behind the thing in her chest that was not a laugh at all, but something larger and quieter and more frightening. "I know. I hated the wall." "I hated the wall too." "Grant?" "Yes. Stop looking at walls." She kissed him. She closed the distance that had been 8 inches, and then 4 months, and then the width of a valley, and a kingdom, and a principle she had built her entire adult life on, and she kissed him in a ditch she designed and he dug. Her hand on his chest, his hand on her waist, the angle marker between their feet, the shovel fallen against the side, the spring sun on both of them in a narrow trench in the earth that was built for irrigation and was holding something else entirely. She kissed him with the directness she did everything. No hesitation, no half measure, the full weight of a woman who had decided and did not do things partially. Her mouth was warm and tasted like the morning's bread, and the nearness of her, the sudden, overwhelming fact of her against him, after months of 8 inches and walls, and the specific torture of her collar-straightening hands, hit him like a physical thing. He made a sound against her mouth that was not a word and was not a growl, and was the specific sound of a wolf whose quiet had broken into something louder and better, and she felt it in his chest under her palm. His heartbeat hammered against her fingers. She held her hand there and let it hammer. Her other hand went to the back of his neck. His other hand came up, not to her hair, not to her face, to the small of her back, pulling her closer. And the closer was careful, the careful of a man who had looked at walls and maintained 8 inches and waited and waited and waited. And the careful was what undid her, because he was still being careful, even now, even with her hand on his chest and her mouth on his, he was still leaving her the exit. She didn't want the exit. She wanted the ditch. She pressed closer. He let her. The narrow trench held them both, and the dirt walls were warm from the sun, and his skin was warm from the work, and the kiss deepened, and the world, which had been a valley and a settlement and a kingdom and a charter, narrowed to the width of 2 people in a trench, and stayed there. They surfaced, foreheads together, both breathing hard, standing in the earth. Finally, Briar said, flat, exhausted. The deadpan relief of a wolf who had been saying one word for 4 months and had begun to wonder if her human was going to require a geological survey and a formal objection before acknowledging the obvious. I have been telling you since the shoulders. The shoulders, Margot. Day 3. The settlement doesn't need you, Margot said, not pulling away, forehead against his, saying it because it was true and because true things needed to be said out loud, especially the ones that scared you. I know. I need you. Those are different things. Those are the most different things in the world. They don't cancel each other out. I spent 4 months trying to make them cancel each other out, and they don't. No, he said, they don't. The settlement runs on choice. Yes. I am choosing you. She pulled back enough to look at him. His eyes were amber and gray at the same time, the wolf and the man in the same gaze, and the gaze was not taking anything. It was just there, present, still, the way a man is still when he has stopped chasing and is waiting to be chosen. Voluntarily, without a bond, without a charter, without a biological imperative. I am choosing you because you dug a ditch and cracked your father's law and looked at a wall instead of at me, and every one of those was a choice, and I want a wolf who chooses. Her, Cairn said, the word he had been saying since night 3, the word that had replaced the hum. But it sounded different now, not a direction, a fact, a stone set down in its final place. Grant looked at her, his hand on her waist, her hand on his chest, the ditch narrow and warm around them. I chose you at the fire on night 3, he said. His voice was quiet, the real one, the one that cracked. When you told me my father never came north to check. You were right and I had nothing, and I have been choosing you every night since. I will choose you tomorrow. I do not need a charter for it. I do not need a bond. He paused. Something in his jaw released, not the clench, the thing behind the clench, the thing that had been set since he was 21 and inherited a system and a coat and a frequency and had been holding all of it ever since. I will come back every spring with a shovel and without a crown, and I will dig whatever you need dug, and I will argue about the angle, and I will not look at a single wall. She laughed, in a ditch, with her hand on his heart and his hand on her waist, and the spring sun on both of them. The angle was fine. The angle was always fine. I know, I designed it. She kissed him again. She had designed the ditch, and she had designed the angle, and she had not designed this, and it was the best thing in the ditch, and the best thing in the valley. And he was choosing her, and she was choosing him, and the choosing was voluntary, and the choosing was the whole point. Close, Briar said, one final time. And then, for the first time in 5 years, she said something else entirely. Home. Chapter 5. The ditch is finished. The elders who had resigned sent a formal letter requesting the treaty be revoked. Grant read it at Margot's kitchen table over breakfast. He was eating bread she had baked that morning, plain, heavy, the kind of bread that tasted like the grain from the mill she had helped build. And the letter was 3 pages of legal argument, citing precedent and charter law and the foundational principle that wolves required alpha bonds for stability. He turned the letter over. He wrote his reply on the back of it in 4 words. The ditch is finished. He sent it by courier. The elders did not write again. Hearthpack grew, the treaty held, the border stayed open. Wolves who wanted to leave the system left. Wolves who wanted to stay in the system stayed. Choice, it turned out, did not destroy a kingdom. It made a king work harder to be worth choosing. He came back every spring, sometimes summer. Once in autumn, because the orchard was producing, and Margot had written him a letter, practical, 3 sentences, no sentiment, that said the pears were coming in early, and the north ditch needed another 10 feet, and his shirt was still in the barn from last time if he wanted it. He did not want it. The shirt was a pretense. She knew it. He knew it. The shirt stayed in the barn. She did not move to the capital. He did not ask her to. He built a house at the southern edge of Hearthpack, small, stone, facing the north field, close enough to the ditch that she could hear the water when the sluice was open. Not in her house, not in her settlement's center, at the edge, where the exit was. Because he had learned, from a woman who counted doors before she sat down, that love lived in the leaving open, not the closing in. She chose him every morning, not by saying it, by staying, by waking in the stone house at the edge of the field, and walking to the square and checking the sluice gate, and arguing about cheese and coming back. The choosing was daily, and the choosing was ordinary, and the ordinary was the whole point. He learned to cook, badly. She taught him how to check the irrigation channels, and he did it with the same thoroughness he did everything, and she watched him do it, and the watching was different now. Not the watching of a woman cataloging a problem, but the watching of a woman who had let someone into the part of her life she had built alone. Cairn and Briar settled into each other the way 2 wolves settle into a shared territory, not by claiming it, but by being in it at the same time, in the same quiet, and letting the quiet be enough. On a morning in June, a year after the ditch and the spring and the choosing, she found him at the sluice gate. He was checking the water level. He had a notebook in his hand. He had started keeping notes on the irrigation, actual notes, with measurements and observations and the careful handwriting of a man who had discovered that paying attention to a thing was its own form of love. She stood behind him for a moment. She watched him write. Then she reached forward and straightened his collar. He went still. The same still. The wolf still. The amber surfacing, warm and gold and unhidden. She said, "It was crooked." He said, "It is never crooked. You just want to touch my collar." She said nothing. He turned. He was smiling. Not the managed kind. Not the ghost of something that might have been a smile in better light. A real one. The kind that reached his gray eyes and turned them into something she was going to look at for the rest of her life. "The angle," he said, "is fine." The angle, she said, was always fine. She kissed him at the sluice gate she had designed and he had learned to maintain, and the water ran through the channel she had cut and he had dug. And the valley was green below them, and the orchard was heavy with pears, and the settlement did not need him, and she did. And those were different things, and they did not cancel each other out. They never would.